Let us take a brief look at the Augustan Age. This is one of the most important periods in English literature because you will get to know a lot about prose writing, novels which came in that period, and there were several popular writers in this age. There were also a lot of periodicals, so there's plenty of periodical literature. So let's take a brief look at this age, and we will look at three rulers. Queen Anne, she ruled from 1702 to 1714. After her, George I, King of England, that is 1714 to 1727, and George II, 1727 to 1760. So now, Queen Anne, in the year 1707, she made England a great power, and England came to be known as Great Britain. In the year 1707, this happened. So now, George I is not just the ruler of England, he is the ruler of Great Britain. Queen Anne is mentioned in Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock. There are two famous lines in that poem where Pope says that the Queen often visited. Sometimes she'd come for counsel and sometimes for tea. That is the line in Rape of the Lock. So the reign of Anne and then the reign of George I and George II, and we have to look at the reign of George I because it is in his period, during his reign, that this term Augustan is going to come up in a new way. George I fancied himself as a great ruler, somebody like the Augustus of the classical age, and poets and writers tend to flatter these royal people, and so Alexander Pope wanted to flatter George I because Alexander Pope knew that George I fancied himself as Augustus of the classical era, and so Alexander Pope wrote an epistle to Augustus. An epistle to Augustus, and in this, the Augustus who's being spoken of in the title is actually George I. So in a way, Alexander Pope seconded George I's idea of himself as Augustus of the classical age. After Alexander Pope's epistle to Augustus came out, there were other writers like Voltaire and Goldsmith, and this is Oliver Goldsmith, and they popularized this term, and they used it to refer to the literature of the 1720s and the 1730s. So this is the background to Augustine. In the classical period, the Romans and the Greeks, during that period in Rome, there had been a very famous a very famous ruler. That was Augustus. The name Augustus, actually, it's a weighty name. It has value. Even today we say august personality, a great personality, august audience, to give the impression of weight, value, importance. And so Augustus was a ruler in that classical era, and George I thought of himself as being as great as that Augustus. And Alexander Pope just went along with it. So this new period which has come in, see, we spoke of the Enlightenment Era, the age of reason, and all that is included in the Augustan Age. The Augustan Age is known as the Neoclassical Age. The Enlightenment is included in it. The Age of Reason is included in it. It is also known as the Age of Scandal, because during this period there were, criminals. They were kings of crime. They were kings of crime. And they were people like Jonathan Wild and Shepherd, another king criminal known as Jack Shepherd. And Daniel Defoe interviewed these king of crimes, or kings of crime rather. He interviewed them and he wrote about them. There were other works in this period. Daniel Defoe wrote Moll Flanders, that's about a girl who turns she becomes a prostitute and things like that. So, these sleazy people, criminals, there was focus on their lives, and so you have the Age of Scandal, which is also an aspect of the Augustan Age. It is not the whole of the Augustan Age. It is one aspect. During the Augustan Age, there will be writers who will focus on these people, criminals and prostitutes and thieves, and write about them. Therefore, this period is known as the Age of Scandal. You already know about the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, which is also included in this period. And during this period, a lot of prose writing happened. There were brilliant novelists. Is one thing. There was also what is known as metafiction writers. So if there is a novel on a novel about a novel, that is metafiction. If there is a play about another play, that is again metafiction. So Samuel Richardson wrote a novel called Pamela. The subtitle of that novel was Virtue rewarded. You can, hunt. I've put a video, long time back I put it, you can hunt for it. Epistolary novel, you'll get that. So if you read about the epistolary novel, you will get to know exactly what Pamela is about. And Samuel Richardson wrote Pamela, and Henry Fielding, a novelist, he made fun of Pamela and he wrote Shamela, metafiction, Shamela. So there were writers like this who wrote about, they wrote a novel about a novel which had already been written, so they made fun of it and things like that. So this is metafiction, and this is going to be a feature of this Augustan age. There will be plenty of novelists in this period. You will have plenty of novelists, and I'll give you a short list of novelists in this period. And you will also have a lot of satire. Jonathan Swift, who wrote Gulliver's Travels. Jonathan Swift wrote A Tale of a Tub, Gulliver's Travels. He was a wonderful satirist, and Gulliver's Travels is a text that you should know. Then Alexander Pope, he was a very great satirist. He wrote the Dunciad, he wrote the Rape of the Lock, and he was a wonderful writer of satire. So like this, you will have a number of satirists in this period. I'm just giving you a broad overview of this period, and we can conclude this video by adding a few names of writers, etc., and you could look them up in order to get a clearer view of them. So before we go on to that list, let us look at some periodicals, because there was a lot of periodical literature during this period. There was a lot of there were several periodicals. Now, Samuel Johnson, so you have periodicals, a lot of periodicals. You have the Rambler, the Gentleman's Magazine. So periodical literature is also a part of this Augustan age. Apart from this, the Augustan age, actually focused on what is known as the heroic couplet when it came to poetry. So that was the main form that was being used, versification, heroic couplet, satire, heroic couplet. These are associated with the Augustan age. The writers of the Augustan age, they went back to the classical writers, and they believed in writing according to rules. They wanted to write according to rules. They did not want to write about rural settings. Their settings were clubs, coffee houses, sophisticated places. So this was the kind of setting that the writers of the Augustan age chose. They wouldn't write about nature. If they felt the need to write about nature, then too they would not write about open nature where nature is free to grow where she likes, not that kind of nature. They would choose a king's palace and his garden, and that would be nature. The description of that well manicured garden of a royal palace, that would be nature, where everything is kept trim and shapely, everything grows in its proper place, That was their idea of nature. They didn't write about rustics and country people. They wrote about people either belonging to elevated society. In the age of scandal, you have a lot of characters belonging to the lower classes. That is a different thing. But by and large, the general trend was to write about people like knights and lords and people like that, people of eminence. Daniel Defoe wrote Moll Flanders. It is based on a real life character called Mary Molyneux. He also wrote Robinson Crusoe. You must have heard of Robinson Crusoe. That's a very, very famous work. Robinson Crusoe. Then you could look up Colonel Jack, Roxana by Daniel Defoe. Similarly, you have Henry Fielding. Of course, he was pulling Samuel Richardson's leg when he wrote Shamela. And he continued to pull Samuel Richardson's leg, when he wrote Joseph Andrews. That's another novel. And in Joseph Andrews, he has shown Joseph Andrews to be the brother of Shamela Andrews. So that was, carrying the fun further. Then Henry Fielding wrote Tom Thumb. That's an attack on Robert Walpole. So you've got to know these. You have Lawrence Sterne's, Tristram Shandy. That's a very important work. And you have the works of Tobias Smollett. These are some of the writers whom you should know. Another important thing in this period is the coming of the first dictionary. Samuel Johnson, he brought out a proposal for the dictionary in the year 1747, and in the year 1755 he actually came out with the dictionary, the first English dictionary, 1755. So these are some of the things that you should know in connection with the Augustan Age. But the Augustan Age is, it's vast when you look at it in terms of the novels which came out, the prose pieces which came out. There was a lot of discussion, back and forth. One would write this and somebody would write something in response. And all this was about the controversy of the ancients and the moderns. Ever since Aristotle and Ptolemy got displaced somehow in people's minds, earlier people had thought that the ancients knew everything. But when certain views got challenged, these people's position became shaky. Of course, they were such giants when it came to knowledge that it was not possible to displace somebody like Aristotle. But yes, certain ideas that had been put forth, from the side of the ancients, they certainly began to be reviewed, and the general idea was that we should not accept everything blindly. And so this argument about the relative superiority of the ancients and the moderns, which you get to see in the Battle of the Books, is one thing, but there is a lot of literature around that. So that is something worth examining and studying.